Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. It all began one chilly autumn evening when I was preparing to do the laundry. My husband had left his coat lying on the chair, and without thinking, I picked it up to hang it in the closet. That's when I saw it, a receipt tucked into the inner pocket. It was from a place I had never heard of, Velvet Abyss. My heart skipped a beat as I read the name. My first thought was that it could be some kind of exclusive, private club. But why hadn't he ever mentioned it? I stared at the receipt, feeling a growing sense of unease. He had always been secretive about certain things, but this was different. This wasn't just a little white lie. It felt like a whole other life was hiding behind that receipt, a life he had been keeping from me. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to find out more. Velvet Abyss. I repeated the name over and over in my mind, trying to figure out why it felt so important. So ominous. It didn't sound like a regular nightclub, not like the ones you see advertised with flashy lights and loud music. No, this felt exclusive, secretive, a place for people who wanted to hide from the world. But why would my husband, someone I thought I knew inside and out, be involved in something like that? It didn't add up. I went online, searching for any mention of Velvet Abyss. There were only a few cryptic references, nothing substantial. I even tried calling the number listed on the receipt, but it went straight to voicemail. The silence only deepened the mystery. The more I thought about it, the more I realized. Whatever was going on, it was dangerous, and I had to find out what it was. The next day, I confronted him. I couldn't just sit there, wondering if my suspicions were true. I asked him about Velvet Abyss, and he seemed genuinely surprised that I had found the receipt. For a moment, he hesitated, then gave me a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, that," he said, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "It's just a gift for one of my clients. It's nothing, really." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But there was something in his tone, something about the way he avoided my gaze, that made my stomach twist. He was lying. I could feel it. But why? Was he hiding something more than just a gift exchange? And if so, what could it possibly be? My thoughts spiraled as the pieces didn't fit. His reassurance didn't bring comfort. It only deepened the mystery. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't let this go. Not when I had this sinking sensation that my husband was keeping a dangerous secret from me. I hired a private detective, someone experienced in cases like mine. At first, I felt guilty, as if I were betraying him. But then I remembered all the lies. How he would disappear for late-night meetings. How he'd come home smelling different, like someone else's perfume. The detective was discreet. He followed my husband for a few days, gathering information about his movements and his contacts. It didn't take long before he came back with unsettling news. Velvet Abyss wasn't just a nightclub. It was something far darker. Something my husband had been deeply involved in for years. I didn't know whether to feel anger or fear. Both emotions clawed at my chest, demanding to be heard. The detective's findings were chilling. Velvet Abyss wasn't just any nightclub. It was a secret society, one hidden from the public eye. It wasn't located in a flashy building or in a typical nightlife district. No, it was concealed behind an old bookstore on the outskirts of the city. The only way to find it was to know the secret, the location, the door, the right time. There was a hidden entrance, one that only a select few knew about. My husband had been going there for months, maybe even longer. My mind raced. How had I never noticed? The secret door, the hidden club, the network of powerful men who frequented it. All of it was right under my nose, and I never suspected a thing. I had to see it for myself. I had to know if the detective's words were true. The detective's report revealed something that left me breathless. Velvet Abyss wasn't just a place for men to indulge in their darkest desires. It catered to an elite group, people I knew. Some of them were high-powered businessmen. Others were prominent figures in our social circle. My stomach churned as I saw their names listed on the guest list. My husband had been hosting private events for people I considered friends, people I trusted. How could he keep something so massive from me? I thought I knew everything about his work, his life, but this was a whole other world, one he'd been hiding with surgical precision. I didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was undeniable. I needed to confront him, but the fear of what I might uncover held me back. How deep did his involvement go? And what kind of danger was I really in? I knew something was terribly wrong when I saw my best friend at Velvet Abyss. She was laughing with my husband, sitting at the same table as some of the men from the guest list. It wasn't just that she was there. It was the way she was acting. She wasn't a mere observer. She was part of the group. The laughter in the dimly lit room sounded different when I heard it. It wasn't the laughter of a gathering. It was the laughter of shared secrets, of complicity. The scene unfolded like a nightmare. My best friend, the woman I confided in, was entangled in this dark world too. She saw me watching from the shadows, but instead of looking guilty or surprised, she merely gave me a small, knowing smile. That smile sent a shiver down my spine. How long had she known? And what had she kept from me? The first time I attended one of their parties, I thought I was prepared. I had to see it with my own eyes, had to understand what was going on. But the moment I walked through the velvet-lined doors of Velvet Abyss, everything I knew about my life crumbled. The place was decadent, over the top in a way that felt obscene. The air was thick with secrets, with unspoken words. The guests weren't just socializing. They were indulging in everything that society deemed forbidden. My husband was the center of it all, but he wasn't the man I married. This was a different version of him, a version I had never seen before. I tried to blend in, to act as though I was part of this twisted game, but the longer I stayed, the more disgusted I became. The parties weren't just about indulgence. They were about control, power, and something much darker than I ever imagined. I couldn't stop myself from returning, even though every fiber of my being screamed for me to run. One night, I decided to follow him, disguised, of course. I waited until he left for another of his business meetings, and then I slipped out behind him. It was a dangerous game, but I had to know the truth. As we drove to the club, I stayed in the shadows, just far enough to remain unseen. When we arrived, I slipped through the back entrance, hoping to go unnoticed. The atmosphere inside was different that night. There was a sense of excitement, of anticipation, as if the rules had been thrown out the window. People wore masks, hiding their identities as they whispered in dark corners. The air felt charged with secrecy. It was then that I saw something that chilled me to the bone. My husband wasn't just a participant. He was orchestrating everything. The power he wielded in that room was terrifying. I had always known that my husband had secrets, but I never imagined they were this profound, this dangerous. He had been living a double life for years, and I had been blind to it. The man I thought I married was a facade, a mask that hid the ruthless, calculating person behind closed doors. Every lie he had told me, every story he spun, was designed to keep me in the dark. But now, as I watched him command the room at Velvet Abyss, I saw the truth. He was no longer the man I loved. He had become something else entirely, someone who thrived in the shadows, someone whose desires went beyond what I could ever understand. The life we had built together seemed like a cruel joke. I was married to a stranger, and I didn't know how to get him back, if he even wanted to come back. The next day, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I confronted him in our living room, the very place where we had shared so many intimate moments. But this time, it felt different, cold, distant. I asked him about the club, about the lies, about everything. His response was calm, too calm. "You don't understand," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "This is my world, and it always has been." His words hit me like a slap in the face. He didn't even seem ashamed. It wasn't just that he was lying to me. It was that he had been living a life so far removed from ours that I couldn't even comprehend it. I demanded the truth, but he just looked at me with pity in his eyes, as if I were the one who was naive. "You'll never understand," he said softly, almost like a threat. I couldn't just walk away. I had to understand everything, and the only way to do that was to go deeper into the heart of Velvet Abyss. The club was more than a place of indulgence. It was a fortress of secrets. One night, after the club had emptied out, I managed to slip past the bouncers and into a hidden part of the building. The basement. It was locked, but I knew there had to be a way in. I waited until the security guard turned his back, and then I slipped through a door that had been left slightly ajar. The basement was nothing like the rest of the club. It was cold, sterile, and eerily silent. But what I saw there made my blood run cold. This was where the real business happened. The deals, the betrayals, the destruction. I had stumbled into the core of his world, and it was darker than I could have ever imagined. In the basement, the walls were lined with filing cabinets, dozens of them, each meticulously organized. My curiosity got the best of me, and I couldn't help but open one. Inside were folders upon folders of names, addresses, and photographs. It wasn't just a collection of club members. It was a detailed dossier of everyone involved in Velvet Abyss: politicians, CEOs, celebrities, and even people I had known my entire life. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was as if my husband had compiled a map of the most powerful people in the city, all under his control. The deeper I looked, the more I uncovered. Criminal activities, blackmail, deals I didn't even want to understand. It was a labyrinth of corruption, and I had unknowingly married the man at the center of it all. This was no longer just a club. It was a web of power that reached far beyond my comprehension. I spent hours in that basement, poring over file after file, the weight of the truth pressing down on me. I had never felt more trapped in my life. Just as I thought I had seen everything, I came across something even more disturbing. A series of photographs showing my husband with a group of men in compromising positions. The images were disturbing, but what struck me even more was the look on his face. It wasn't the look of someone trying to maintain control or power. It was the look of someone completely surrendered to the moment, someone who had long since given up any pretense of normalcy. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My husband wasn't just running a club. He was living a life I couldn't even begin to understand. And in the shadows of that basement, I realized how deeply entangled I was in it. That night, I confronted him again. The man I had married sat before me, but this time, there was no veil of normality between us. I threw the photographs on the table, demanding answers. He didn't flinch. "You wanted to know what I've been doing, didn't you?" he said, his voice colder than I had ever heard it before. "Well, now you know." There was no apology, no remorse, just a chilling indifference. "You can't escape it now. You never could." I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. The truth was more horrific than anything I had imagined. He wasn't just involved in something illegal or dangerous. He was fully immersed in a world of power, manipulation, and darkness that I could never be a part of. The person sitting in front of me was no longer my husband. He was a stranger, a man who had long since abandoned any semblance of love or morality. The next few days were a blur of confusion and terror. My husband wasn't talking, but he didn't need to. The silence spoke volumes. The more I tried to piece together what had happened to the man I had married, the more I realized that this world, this dark, twisted world he had created, was more powerful than anything I had imagined. It was as if he had made a deal with the devil, one that promised power and wealth in exchange for his soul. I spent sleepless nights and a days, not knowing what to do. I could leave, but that would only put a target on my back. There was no escape from this world, not unless I played by its rules. My husband had become a puppet, and I was the one who had to decide whether to pull the strings or let him continue down the path that led to darkness. I couldn't help but watch him more closely now. Every word he said felt like a lie, every gesture a calculated move. He wasn't the same man I had married. His eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, were now cold, calculating, always scanning, always watching. I caught him speaking on the phone late one night, his voice low, urgent. "The deal is done. We just have to wait for the next step." He hung up before I could say anything. I had no idea who he was talking to or what the deal was about, but I knew it had something to do with Velvet Abyss. Everything was connected. There was no part of his life, no part of our marriage, that wasn't tainted by this world. He had turned into a stranger, a man who no longer cared about me, only about the game he was playing. The lies were unraveling, and so was I. As I dug deeper into his world, I began to uncover the network of alliances he had formed over the years. He wasn't just a participant in Velvet Abyss. He was one of its key players. His influence stretched across industries, from finance to politics, and even into law enforcement. The club was a front for something much bigger, something international. He had surrounded himself with dangerous people, people who weren't afraid to destroy anyone who got in their way. I felt the weight of this truth in every fiber of my being. I had married into a criminal empire, and there was no easy way out. But what frightened me the most wasn't just the danger he posed to others. It was the way he had manipulated me, kept me in the dark for so long. I had no idea who I had been living with, and now I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. The closer I got to the truth, the more I realized how tightly the web was woven around me. My every move was being watched, every decision scrutinized. My husband had eyes everywhere, and I was beginning to feel like a puppet on a string. It wasn't just the club anymore. It was my entire life. I began noticing the small things. A car parked across the street for days at a time, strangers who would seem to appear out of nowhere whenever I was out in public, the subtle way people would start avoiding me. I had no privacy, no safety. It was as if I were living in a constant state of surveillance. The more I tried to fight back, the more I realized that I wasn't just fighting my husband. I was fighting an entire world that was determined to keep its secrets buried. I knew I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't stay in this nightmare, where every move I made was being watched, every conversation overheard. But leaving wasn't as simple as packing a bag and walking out the door. If I left, I would be in danger. If I stayed, I risked losing everything. I had to find a way to escape, to take back my life. The plan formed slowly, but it was the only way out. I started gathering evidence, photographs, recordings, anything that could help me expose the truth. But every time I thought I was making progress, something would happen to set me back. A phone call, a warning, a threatening letter. It was as if the more I tried to escape, the more the world around me closed in. But I couldn't stop. I had to leave. I had to find a way out. I thought I had been careful. I thought my plan was foolproof. But the more I tried to gather information, the more the silence around me grew heavy with danger. One afternoon, as I was going through old documents in my study, I noticed a small envelope slipped under the door. Inside, there was no return address, only a single sentence scrawled in jagged handwriting. "You're getting too close. Stop now." My heart raced. The room seemed to close in around me as I read the message over and over. Who was watching me? And how did they know what I was doing? My husband hadn't said anything, but I could feel his presence like a shadow in the corner of my mind. Was he involved? Was he the one sending these messages to scare me? Or was it someone else? The silence was suffocating, and every passing moment made me feel more like a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't let fear control me. I had come too far, learned too much. It was time to make the first move, and I knew it had to be bold. I reached out to the only person I trusted, the private detective who had been helping me all along. I arranged a meeting at a public cafe, far from the prying eyes of those who might be watching. He confirmed what I had been dreading. My husband wasn't just involved in the club. He was a key player in an underground network that spanned across several countries. The detective had tracked the money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, funneled through obscure accounts and shady deals. The club was just the surface. Beneath it was an empire of corruption, one that my husband was at the very center of. He warned me that I needed to be careful. If I continued, there would be no going back. But I had no choice. I was already in too deep. The deeper I went into my investigation, the more I realized that the truth was far worse than I could have imagined. My husband's connections weren't just criminal. They were political, powerful, and deeply entrenched in the fabric of society. People I had known for years, people I had trusted, were all part of this web of lies and corruption. I started connecting the dots between Velvet Abyss and the city's most influential figures. The club wasn't just a place of indulgence. It was a center for blackmail, for deals made in the dark, for political leverage. My husband had been using me, using everyone, to climb higher and higher in this dangerous game. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how far-reaching this network was. There was no one I could trust anymore, not even myself. I had a moment of clarity, a terrifying, painful clarity. Everything I had thought I knew about my life, about my marriage, was a lie. I had spent years building a life with a man who had been leading a completely different existence behind closed doors. I wasn't just his wife. I was a pawn in his game, a tool to be used and discarded. The more I saw, the more I understood just how far my husband had gone. This wasn't about love, It wasn't even about power. This was about control. He had manipulated everyone, his friends, his colleagues, me, into playing a part in his grand scheme. But what scared me the most was that, somehow, I had been complicit in it all. I had played my role without even realizing it. And now, the mirror of my own life was shattered. I had to pick up the pieces, but I wasn't sure who I even was anymore. There was no going back now. I had seen too much, learned too much. I had to leave before it was too late. But getting out wasn't as simple as walking away. My husband had eyes everywhere, and I couldn't trust anyone. I had to be careful, methodical. I began to make secret arrangements, securing my finances, contacting old friends who could help me disappear. The fear of being discovered was always there, gnawing at me. Every time I heard a knock at the door, every time my phone buzzed with an unknown number, I felt my heart skip a beat. Would he find out? Would he try to stop me? But the desire for freedom outweighed the fear. I packed my things slowly, methodically, knowing that once I left, there was no coming back. I couldn't stay in this suffocating life any longer. I had to escape. Just as I thought I was ready, the storm hit. One night, after I had packed nearly everything, I came home to find my husband sitting in the living room, his face an unreadable mask. "You've been acting strange," he said, his voice eerily calm. "Where are you going?" I froze. My heart raced as I tried to think of an answer, but my mind was blank. How had he known? How much had he figured out? His eyes narrowed as he watched me closely. I knew that this was the moment that would decide everything. Would I break under the pressure, or would I find a way to keep going? The silence between us was suffocating, thick with tension. It felt as though everything I had worked for, everything I had planned, was hanging by a thread. The moment I had feared had finally arrived. I couldn't hide the truth from him any longer. But in that moment, I realized something crucial. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I wasn't afraid of the empire he had built, or the people who worked for him. I was done playing the role of the silent wife, the obedient partner. "I'm leaving," I said, my voice steady, though my heart pounded in my chest. His face twisted with anger, but there was a flicker of something else, something dark. "You can't leave," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You'll never be free from this world. You're mine." But I stood my ground. Not anymore. The room seemed to close in as I walked toward the door, knowing that once I stepped out, there would be no turning back. I was leaving behind everything. My husband, my old life, the safety of the familiar. But I was taking my freedom back, piece by piece. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew it had to be far from here. The city, my old life, it all felt suffocating now. I drove, without a clear destination, until the landscape began to change. The night was quiet, the streets empty. The further I went, the more I felt like I was shedding layers of myself, leaving behind the woman I had been, the one who had been manipulated and controlled. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. I had escaped the clutches of my husband's world. I didn't know what would happen next, but I was determined to face it on my own terms. I was free, for better or worse. And in that freedom, I found something even more important: myself. Freedom, I had come to realize, wasn't just about walking away from the life I knew. It was about the consequences of that decision. In the days that followed, I lived in constant fear, always looking over my shoulder, wondering when they would find me. I had left behind my husband, his empire, the men who controlled everything from the shadows, but I had also left behind safety. I didn't know where to turn or who to trust. It was an eerie, empty feeling to be free, but also to be hunted. The quiet nights were the hardest. I couldn't sleep without hearing the echo of footsteps behind me, the soft whisper of danger waiting just around the corner. I couldn't stop thinking about the life I had left behind, the people I'd once known, and the price I had paid for my freedom. I had lost everything, but at least I still had my life. Just as I thought I had left my old life behind, I began to see how deeply my husband's world had reached into every corner of society. People I had once called friends were no longer who they appeared to be. One evening, as I sat at a cafe, an old acquaintance from my past approached. He was a familiar face, someone I thought I could trust. But when he sat down across from me, I saw the glint of something in his eyes, something cold and calculating. "You can't hide forever," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You're not the only one who's watching." I froze, a chill running down my spine. My husband's influence was far-reaching. No matter where I went, there would always be someone watching, waiting for the right moment to pull me back into the web. I realized that leaving was only the beginning. The real battle was staying free. No matter how far I ran, no matter how many times I changed locations, the past kept catching up with me. It wasn't just the men from my husband's world who were hunting me. It was the memories, the haunting memories of everything I had lived through. I couldn't escape the moments when I had trusted him, when I had believed in the facade of our perfect life. It was as if I were constantly trapped in a loop, replaying the scenes of betrayal, lies, and manipulation over and over again. The man I had loved, the man I had thought was my partner, had never existed. He had been a mask, a carefully constructed illusion that had fooled me for years. I had spent so long believing in the fantasy, in the fairy tale of our marriage, that I hadn't realized the nightmare we were living in until it was too late. In the midst of my isolation, an unexpected ally appeared. It was someone I never thought I would see again, Marissa. A woman who had once been close to my husband. She had always been an enigma, someone who floated around the edges of his world, never quite fully involved but never far away either. She reached out to me one day, her voice trembling on the other end of the phone. "I know what you're running from," she said. "I know what he did." She was the first person to offer me a sliver of hope in weeks. She was scared, but she also seemed to understand the dangers I was facing. "I can help you," she whispered, "but you have to trust me." It was a dangerous proposition. Trust was something I had long since lost, especially with people from that world. But there was something in her voice that made me think she was genuine. She wanted out too. Marissa was right. She was trapped just as much as I was. The more she told me about her connection to my husband's empire, the more I realized how deep the corruption ran. She had been involved in the club, in the deals, in the web of power and influence. But what struck me the most was the way she spoke of the power it had over her. "You don't leave unless they let you," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of her own experiences. "It's like a contract you can't break. Once you're in for life." I could feel the weight of her words, the warning in them. Leaving wasn't as simple as just walking away. If I wanted to truly be free, I would have to make a deal with the devil himself. Marissa's offer to help me wasn't without its risks. As much as I wanted to trust her, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if she had her own agenda. The more I spent time with her, the more I realized just how complicated this world was. Nothing was ever what it seemed. I received a call late one night. It was Marissa. Her voice panicked. "They know," she whispered. "They know everything. They know I've been talking to you." I tried to calm her down, but it was too late. By the time I reached her apartment, she was gone. The place was a mess, papers scattered everywhere, her belongings left behind in a hasty exit. There was a note on the floor, addressed to me. It read, "I didn't have a choice. I'm sorry." And just like that, the only person who had tried to help me disappeared. It was a cruel reminder that in this world, trust was a luxury I couldn't afford. I knew what I had to do. It wasn't just about running anymore. It wasn't just about surviving. I was going to take down my husband's empire, piece by piece. I began gathering everything I had learned, the files, the photographs, the connections. I would expose him for the world to see. But as I began putting my plan into motion, I realized just how dangerous it was. The deeper I dug, the more I found myself questioning my own safety. Who could I trust? Who was with me and who was working for him? It was a game of cat and mouse now, and the stakes were higher than ever. The reckoning was coming, and I had no choice but to face it head-on. The question wasn't whether I would win, it was whether I would survive. As I ventured deeper into my plan, it became clear that my every move was being watched. I had thought I was being clever, covering my tracks, but the eyes in the dark never ceased to follow me. The more I investigated, the more it seemed like my husband's influence stretched beyond anything I could have imagined. I wasn't just up against him anymore. I was up against an entire network of corrupt officials, criminals, and businessmen. each one more ruthless than the last. My every attempt to gather evidence was met with obstacles. Files were missing, people I tried to talk to suddenly disappeared, and even my phone was bugged. It was like I was living in a nightmare where the walls kept closing in, and there was no escape. I had underestimated just how far this web of control had spread. But no matter how dark it got, I wasn't about to back down now. I would fight for my freedom, even if it meant taking on an army of shadows. Just when I thought I had hit a wall, I discovered a shocking twist in the story. One night, as I was rifling through my husband's old documents, I found a hidden ledger. Its contents not just about money or criminal dealings, but personal connections. There, in black and white, was the name of someone I never thought I'd see, Marissa. She had been more involved than I had realized. The woman who had once claimed to want to help me was deeply entangled in the very web I was trying to break free from. It made my blood run cold. Was she a spy? Had she been using me all along? But as I read further, something didn't add up. There were names, dates, and a trail of communications that seemed to suggest that Marissa had been trying to work against my husband's empire from the inside. She had been playing a dangerous game of her own, and her betrayal wasn't as clear-cut as I'd thought. I was left with more questions than answers, but one thing was for sure. Marissa had never been just an innocent ally. The discovery of Marissa's true involvement changed everything. I had trusted her. I had let my guard down, believing that someone understood my struggle. But now, it was clear that trust was a currency I could no longer afford. I had to face the reality that no one was truly on my side, not even the people I thought I could rely on. In this world, everyone had their own agenda, their own reasons for playing the game. No one was above suspicion. Every person I came into contact with now became a potential threat. I had learned the hard way that trusting anyone in this dangerous game came at a steep price, and I had already paid it. I couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. Even as I grappled with the knowledge of Marissa's betrayal, something inside me refused to let go of the idea of fighting back. I couldn't just walk away from everything I had uncovered. I had to finish what I had started, and yet, I knew I needed help. I couldn't do this alone. That's when I reached out to someone who had been in the shadows for far longer than I had realized. A former associate of my husband's, a man whose name had appeared several times in the ledger I had found. He had always been an enigma, someone who kept his distance, never fully trusting anyone. But now, with everything at stake, I had to take the risk. I sent him a message, a simple, cryptic invitation. "I know what you've been hiding." To my surprise, he responded, "Meet me tomorrow at midnight. The truth will come to light." The meeting was set for midnight, in a dark alley on the outskirts of town. It felt like the final chapter of a story I had been living for far too long. I arrived early, my heart pounding in my chest. The night was silent, the city lights flickering like distant stars. When he finally appeared, I could see the caution in his eyes. He wasn't sure whether to trust me, but he was desperate for something. Perhaps redemption, perhaps escape. We exchanged no pleasantries. I didn't waste time. "What do you know about my husband's empire?" I demanded. He studied me for a long moment, weighing his words. Finally, he spoke. "Your husband isn't the only one involved. There are people much more dangerous than him. And if you want to survive this, you're going to need allies. Real ones." He handed me a thick envelope, its contents a map, and a list of names I had never heard before. "This is your way out. But you have to act fast. They know about you. They know you're coming for them." The envelope contained more than just names. It contained a plan. A blueprint for how I could bring my husband's empire to its knees. It was a risky, dangerous plan, one that required precision and timing. But if I succeeded, I would expose everything. The corruption, the lies, the manipulation, everything would come crashing down. I spent the next few days preparing, setting the pieces in motion. I contacted the people on the list, some of them old contacts of my husband's, others more shadowy figures from the underworld. I couldn't trust any of them completely, but I didn't have a choice. The plan was set, the wheels were in motion. But as the days passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't shake the sense that my every move was being tracked. And then it hit me. I wasn't just facing my husband's empire. I was facing something far more dangerous. The danger wasn't just in the open anymore. As I prepared for the final stage of my plan, the shadows seemed to move around me, circling like vultures. I had been careful, too careful, perhaps, but it was becoming clear that there was no escaping the web I had tangled myself in. The people I was working with were now under surveillance. I began receiving anonymous threats, cryptic messages warning me to stop, to back off before it was too late. I ignored them, but the fear was creeping in again. The price of this fight was becoming too high. I couldn't tell who was a friend and who was a foe. Everyone seemed to be playing their own game, and I was just a pawn in theirs. But I had no choice but to keep going. There was too much at stake, and I was too close to the truth. The shadows were closing in, but I couldn't stop now. I had to finish what I had started. Just when I thought I could trust no one, I learned that the one person I had counted on the most, the one person who had promised to help me, was the one who had betrayed me the most. It was Marissa. She had been playing both sides from the beginning. All along, she had been feeding my every move to my husband's people, using me as a pawn to get closer to her own goal. When I confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. "You're nothing but a tool," she said, her eyes cold and empty. "I've been using you to get what I need, and now I don't need you anymore." The betrayal was gut-wrenching, but it only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to let her, or anyone else, take everything I had worked for. I had one last chance, and I was going to use it. Everything had led to this moment, the breaking point, betrayal from all sides, my allies vanishing into thin air, and the overwhelming pressure of knowing that the walls were closing in. I had been running, fighting, and hiding for what felt like forever. But the truth was, I was exhausted. My mind was a tangle of conflicting thoughts and fears, my body strained from the constant vigilance. I knew I couldn't keep going like this forever. But just when I thought I might snap, I received a message, an encrypted email with a location and a single line of text. "It's time to end this." No name, no sender. But something in the way the words were phrased made me feel like I had no choice but to follow the instructions. I packed my things and left without a second thought. This could be my chance to finally take control of my life, to bring it all to an end. The location was a dilapidated warehouse on the edge of the city. As I walked through the rusted gates, I could feel the weight of everything pressing down on me. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a final confrontation. Inside the warehouse, the dim light flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. I wasn't alone. As I stepped further into the cavernous space, I saw him, my husband, standing in the center of the room, his cold eyes locking onto mine. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice laced with malice. But there was something different in his demeanor, something I hadn't seen before. Fear. It was fleeting, but it was there. It made me realize just how much power I had in that moment. He wasn't the man I had married. That much was clear now. The man standing before me, cold and calculating, was nothing more than a stranger, someone I had never really known. His once perfect mask had begun to crack, and now I could see the true face of the monster I had spent years with. He stepped toward me slowly, the tension thick in the air. "You've ruined everything," he growled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Everything I've built, you've destroyed." I didn't flinch. I stood my ground, every inch of me screaming to fight, to take back control. "You never built anything," I spat, the words sharp and bitter. "You've been tearing people down for years, using them, abusing them." I was just too blind to see it. The mask had fallen, and now I could finally see him for what he truly was. The confrontation between us escalated quickly, words turning into threats, and threats into violence. But something unexpected happened as he shouted at me, as his rage filled the room. He faltered, his anger suddenly dissipating into something else. "You think you're the only one who's been hurt?" he snapped, his voice cracking with emotion. "I've sacrificed everything for this. For us. For you." His words were like a slap in the face. He had always painted himself as the victim, as if everything he had done was justified by some twisted sense of love or loyalty. But it was all lies. All of it. I could finally see the truth of it. His actions weren't for love. They were for power, for control. I had been nothing more than a pawn in his game. The world he had built around me was nothing but a carefully orchestrated illusion, one that I had been trapped in for far too long. As the tension between us thickened, I realized something else. The game wasn't over. The plan I had been part of, the network I had uncovered, was still in motion. My husband's empire was vast, far-reaching, and it didn't just end with me walking away. There were far bigger players involved, people who would do anything to protect their interests, even if it meant destroying me. I had been too focused on my husband's betrayal, on the emotional toll of everything he had put me through, to see the bigger picture. The truth was, I had been part of something much darker than I could have imagined. I wasn't just fighting him anymore. I was fighting an entire system, one built on lies, deceit, and manipulation. And now, it seemed that my husband was more determined than ever to drag me back into his world. The war had been fought in silence for far too long, but now it was out in the open. As my husband made his threats, I knew that I was no longer just fighting for my freedom. I was fighting for my life. The people in his world, the ones pulling the strings from the shadows, were not the kind of people who let go easily. They didn't tolerate betrayal, and they didn't care who got hurt in the process. They would do anything to protect their secrets. But I was no longer the helpless woman I had once been. The years of manipulation had shaped me into someone stronger, someone who was no longer afraid to fight back. I had nothing left to lose. This was it, the final confrontation. My husband had come for me, but this time, I wasn't going to run. The game had changed. The stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about us anymore. It was about everything we had built, everything we had lost. The air was thick with tension as he approached, his face twisted with fury. But I was ready. As he spoke, his words came out like venom, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He wasn't as sure of his control as he used to be. The facade was cracking, and for the first time, I saw a glimpse of fear in him. Fear of losing everything. Fear of me. "You can't win," he spat, but his voice wavered. "You'll never get away from me." I stepped forward, my voice steady but resolute. "I already have." And in that moment, I realized the truth. He had already lost. The empire he had built, the world he had created. It was all crumbling, and I was the one who would bring it down. The choice was mine now. As the world around me started to crumble, I knew I had to decide how this would end. Would I walk away and leave the wreckage behind? Or would I fight until there was nothing left? I could hear the sounds of footsteps approaching, the sirens in the distance. Time was running out. The walls were closing in again, and I had to act fast. The weight of my decision was heavy, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't go back. No matter what the consequences were, no matter how much I had to sacrifice, I couldn't live in the shadow of this life any longer. It was time to step into the light, to take control of my future, no matter the cost. With the final choice before me, I knew the risk was immense. Walking away now meant I would never be free from the dark underworld that had consumed my life. But staying meant continuing to live in fear, trapped in a web I could never escape. I wasn't just fighting for my own survival anymore. I was fighting for the chance to truly live. The final gamble was set. As I prepared to make my move, I realized that everything I had done up until this point had been leading to this exact moment. Every betrayal, every tear, every moment of doubt, none of it had been in vain. I was stronger than ever, and in the end, I knew that the risk I was about to take would either set me free or destroy everything. Just as I was about to make my final move, something shifted in the air. It wasn't my husband. It wasn't even his loyal followers. The enemy I had been fighting was something deeper, something more insidious. It wasn't just the people I could see. It was the system itself, a system that had been designed to crush anyone who tried to escape. I wasn't just battling one man or his empire. I was battling a shadowy force that extended into every corner of society, every institution. The odds seemed impossible. I had underestimated the true extent of what I was up against. But as I stood at the edge, staring into the abyss, I realized that the only way out was to expose it all, tear down the system piece by piece and force it to crumble under the weight of its own corruption. The trap had closed, and I was right in the center of it. My every move had been anticipated. Every plan I'd set into motion countered by someone more powerful than me. The sudden feeling of being trapped, of not having any way out, made my pulse race. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized the full scope of my mistake. I had underestimated just how far my husband's influence reached. He wasn't just a criminal mastermind. He had his fingers in everything, from politics to law enforcement, to the very people I trusted to help me. I could feel the walls closing in, the threat of being completely exposed weighing heavily on my shoulders. But there was one thing I hadn't counted on: my own resilience. I wouldn't go down without a fight. In the face of what seemed like certain defeat, an unexpected ally appeared. It was Marissa. Yes, the woman who had once betrayed me. But this time, there was no malice in her eyes. She was different. She came to me, not with words of betrayal, but with an offer. I can help you. We can take him down together. At first, I couldn't trust her. The wounds of her past betrayals were still fresh. But then she explained how she had been working against my husband all along, playing a dangerous game of her own. I never wanted to hurt you, she confessed, but I needed the leverage. I had no choice. The truth was, she had been trapped too, manipulated by the same people who had been controlling my every move. Maybe, just maybe, we could finally bring it all to an end. With Marissa's unexpected help, we set the stage for the final move. The game had changed. No longer was I fighting alone. I had someone who understood the depth of the danger, who had first-hand knowledge of the people I was up against. Together, we devised a plan to expose my husband's empire for what it was, to bring down everyone involved, from the corrupt officials to the dangerous men who had been pulling the strings. It would be risky, far more so than anything I had attempted before. But I knew that if we succeeded, it would all be over. No more running. No more hiding. This was the final battle, the one that would decide everything. The time had come. With the final move in place, we executed the plan. Every step had been calculated, every detail covered. The moment I walked into that room, I knew everything had led to this point. The confrontation wasn't just with my husband anymore. It was with the entire system that had held us all in its grasp. As the room filled with the sound of sirens and the heavy footsteps of law enforcement, I saw the fear in his eyes, the realization that everything he had built was collapsing. But he wasn't going down without a fight. "You think you've won?" he hissed, his voice thick with venom. "You've only just begun to understand what you're up against." But I was no longer afraid. The truth had already come to light, and nothing he could say would change that. The empire that my husband had built, an empire of lies, manipulation, and ruthless control, was falling apart before my eyes. As the authorities closed in, the weight of everything I had been through began to hit me. The years of fear, the manipulation, the lies. It was all crumbling. But instead of feeling relief, I felt emptiness. How do you process the destruction of everything you thought you knew? How do you come to terms with the fact that the life you had fought so hard to build had been nothing more than an illusion? But there was no time for reflection. The final act was still unfolding, and I had to be ready for whatever came next. As the last of my husband's empire was dismantled, I realized that freedom came at a price. The cost had been high, too high. I had lost people along the way, trusted the wrong allies, and risked everything for a chance at something better. But the one thing I had gained was my independence. I wasn't a pawn anymore. I wasn't controlled by anyone. For the first time in years, I was free to choose my own path. But freedom was not without its scars. I had been marked by everything that had happened. The betrayal, the pain, the loss. It would always be a part of me. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone take my power again. The dust had settled, and the world had changed. I stood at the edge of the life I had once known, looking ahead at the unknown. Everything I had fought for had come to fruition, but the future was still uncertain. The journey had been long, and the scars would always be there, but I had learned to live with them. The woman I was before was no longer here. I was someone new, someone stronger, more resilient, and as I stepped into the new chapter of my life, I knew that I would never again be defined by the past. The future was mine to shape.